they have these high-precision weapons that cost millions of dollars apiece, and they're firing them off like popcorn. I live in a village not far from Moscow, just to the south, and we hear the air battles going on over our heads all the time. That's new. The number of Ukrainian drones that are getting close to Moscow and as far as Moscow has really increased, and they're striking in targets that are like hundreds and even thousands kilometers away from the border. Russia has surprised everyone, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the hollowing out of its industrial base, by moving to a war footing, and it's now producing far more ammunition, missiles, drones, precision-guided weapons than the entire West combined. The Trump administration has dealt a body blow to American credibility. I mean, just count the ways. We have Russian commentators, some very influential voices, complaining that Vladimir Putin isn't prosecuting the war effectively enough. Putin told Trump that if Ukraine will voluntarily withdraw from the entire Donbass, from that 20% or so that it's still held, we will agree to a general ceasefire and start discussing terms for ending the war. I wouldn't bet on Russian collapse or Putin being overthrown or any of that. All that talk that was going on a month or so ago about how Ukraine is turning the tide and possibly winning the war, that has evaporated. Chinese have been very closely observing the Russia-Ukraine war from the Russian side. They've probably taken on board the lessons, and they have a huge drone industry.
Considering that you are reporting in Moscow, could you let us know if there are any tidbits that you've learned about what it's like to work with Putin? Hello and a very warm welcome to all. You're watching Hindustan Times and my name is Aayesha Varma. On today's show, we have Fred Weir joining us. He's a Canadian journalist who lives in Moscow, and we'll be speaking about the Russia-Ukraine war and how exactly America's depleted weapons stockpiles due to the Iran war make a difference. But that's not all. We'll also be talking about other aspects of the war, so stay tuned. Mr. Weir, thank you once again for taking out the time to speak with us.
My pleasure.
Mr. Weir, Iran has been using tech that runs into the tens of thousands cost-wise. Russia adopted this tech and now produces those same drones itself. America, on the other hand, has been using interceptors that cost millions to make. Why do you think America is lagging behind as far as warfare evolution is concerned?
I think that it's probably a problem with superpowers that they are heavily bureaucratized. They're always fighting the last war. And most of the American military, the U.S. Navy in particular, was designed to fight the Soviet Navy. And if that's what they were doing now, they would really be kicking. But they're not. They're in a completely unscripted situation for them. And they have these high-precision weapons that cost millions of dollars apiece, and they're firing them off like popcorn against weapons that are, as you mentioned, cheaply mass-produced. This is, they are in a situation and can't quickly ramp up to adapt to it. This is another mystery, is why U.S. industry, being the leading force in the world, can't quickly manufacture, first of all, change gears, and then manufacture weapons at the rate that they need to do to stay in this war effectively. Russia has surprised everyone, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the hollowing out of its industrial base, by moving to a war footing, and it's now producing far more ammunition, missiles, drones, precision-guided weapons than the entire West combined. Go figure.
Recent reporting also says that Western deliveries of air defense missiles have fallen sharply, while Ukraine's missile interception rate has dropped from about 66.7% over the comparable 2025 period to about 44.4% in 2026. Do you think it would be correct to say that America's war with Iran has greatly benefited Russia when it comes to this aspect?
Sure. I mean, as a journalist, I can say that the Kremlin would deny it hotly,
Hmm.
but that would be against their foreign policy principles to say this is a good war for them or something like that. But obviously, on many fronts, this war has really benefited the Kremlin. First, by depleting the ammunition stocks, as you pointed out. Second, by jacking up oil prices. Russia made more last month on its crude exports than it did, I think something like 20% more than the same month last year. And also, this Iran war, has changed the conversation about wars of aggression in ways that make Russia look not as bad as it did before.
So beyond that, now that Kyiv is being pushed to use cheaper drones because this all overlaps, rather than America's sophisticated weaponry, do you think that the weapon stockpile depletion has also actually helped Ukraine in the bigger picture? They have a wider network now, and if so, who do you think it's helped more, Russia or Ukraine?
The thing that gives Russia its absolute advantage right now in the war, in the escalations that are currently taking place, is its bunch of different ballistic missiles. It has ballistic missiles, which it's using quite a lot in recent days, and it has hypersonic missiles, which cannot be intercepted by any of the garden variety air defenses that Ukraine has. They need those Patriot and even late model PAC-3 Patriot interceptors to take out the ballistic missiles. They don't. I mean, nobody knows how many they have left, but apparently it's pretty a dwindling stock. And so I think in recent days, virtually all of the ballistic missiles that Russia has fired at Kiev mainly have gotten through. The Ukrainians have stopped announcing how many they intercept, but that in itself tells you the news would be for them pretty bad.
There are also assumptions that the United States is a superpower that has an unlimited stock of weapons that can be used by allies. We've already seen the impact that it's had on both Ukraine and the Gulf. These assumptions are now crumbling. So how do you think that this will impact America's strategic relations going forward?
Well, I guess, on many fronts, the Trump administration has dealt a body blow to American credibility. Just count the ways. But yes, this would be one of them as a reliable arsenal of democracy, which is how it was advertised through the whole Cold War era. It turns out to be not the case. And unless America itself goes on a war footing, and it has done that before, let's never underestimate the United States and the deep well springs of economic power and technological might that it has. Still, they don't show any signs of getting it together. I read just this morning that General Dynamics, having taken many billions of dollars worth of arms contracts, has only delivered 30% of what it had promised by this time. So there is a malaise in America's storied military-industrial complex that is ongoing.
Russia is also focusing more on nuclear technology, such as nuclear-powered submarines and nuclear-powered missiles, such as the Burevestnik. Do you think that there's a perception that nuclear war could break out soon, or do you think this is just general preparation, given the nuclear arms race?
Well, these exotic weapons that Russia is fielding, like the Burevestnik that you mentioned, and the underwater torpedo, I believe it's called the Poseidon, these have been on the books for quite a long time. They're coming online now, but they were designed to thwart missile defense. Donald Trump's Golden Dome is just the latest iteration of, the American preoccupation with building an umbrella against nuclear missile attack. Ronald Reagan started it. And so these weapons have been in planning and in development for a long time, and they're meant to maintain Russia's nuclear deterrent under new circumstances. But of course, the danger of nuclear war is accelerated or aggravated by the way the Ukraine war is going, and it's spreading. We've had many examples of missiles and drones straying into European NATO territory. We have Russian commentators, some very influential voices, complaining that Vladimir Putin isn't prosecuting the war effectively enough. He needs to restore Russia's deterrent with Europe by perhaps attacking all the European plants that are building drones and other weaponry for Ukraine. There is a constant drumbeat of voices saying that Ukraine shouldn't be able to acquire all these supplies, all these weapons from Europe with impunity, and the Europeans should stop supplying Ukraine. And the only way to show them that it would be to strike some of these factories and supply depots, which, that's the formula for World War III right there. And any general war that started between NATO and Russia would pose immediate threat of nuclear.
It's funny that you mentioned World War III. There are a few developments that we're looking at across the board. One, of course, is China-Taiwan. We'll get to that. But, speaking about a more recent development, the former Russian president had issued a warning after Tokyo protested Putin's first ever visit to Kuril Islands. Medvedev said that the archipelago will forever remain Russian land, with Japan looking for trouble by continuing to stick to its claim. How do you see this development, considering this dispute has been the main obstacle to Moscow and Tokyo signing a formal peace treaty in the 8 decades since the conflict?
Well, it's, as you're pointing out, a recurring scandal. Whenever the Kuril Islands are mentioned, this problem comes up. Russia seized these islands at the end of World War II. They aren't any kind of traditional Russian territory, and even in the 1950s, there was a peace deal on the table where Russia would give up half of them in exchange for a peace treaty. So presumably it's still negotiable, but when nationalists start with their rhetoric, these things get overheated, and people talk about our sacred territory, and the Japanese do it too, because those islands are not their sacred territory either, not really, but it is
Japan does seem to be looking at the
contention.
northern territories.
Yeah, that's what they call it. This I think there are 4 islands, the Kuril Islands, and Putin must have known when he went there the other day that he was going to create a scandal with the Japanese, and he reliably did that. He must have had his reasons for it, but it will blow over. The problem is ongoing, as you said, 80 years, but this particular episode will blow over.
So then beyond Japan as well, if we look at the relationship between London and Moscow, it has essentially deteriorated significantly long before the escalation of the Ukraine conflict in 2022. But more recently, the UK fears naval escalation with Russia. This is a report that came out in the last week or so. There's likewise been no direct contact between the two countries' defense ministers since October 2022, but contact can be established via the embassies. But can you explain why this is happening and why exactly the UK is fearing an escalation with Russia?
I don't know this. There's a feature to Britain's relations with Russia and the Soviet Union before it that have a certain poignancy. I've never fully understood it. Maybe it's post-imperial, part of their, their mentality, but they fixate on Russia quite unnecessarily because Russia is rather far away and they don't have much to do with each other. Even at the height of Russia's trade with the European Union, all the gas that Russia was selling to Europe, Britain didn't buy that much of Russian gas. So there are psychological factors at work here. One of which I dare say is that Britain itself is in a bit of a crisis. It can't seem to keep a prime minister in place for very long. And so it's very common with people in political trouble to point the finger at an external enemy and act bold and brave and confrontational, which the late Prime Minister Keir Starmer was doing, and the new one is picked up that baton. But it's a lot of rhetoric, which also, though, as you mentioned, it poses a danger of escalation. Just today, the Russian foreign minister was warning stringently against this new tendency of EU states to seize Russian oil tankers, or even if they're flagged with a different country, they're carrying Russian cargo. They're called the shadow fleet. And there have been some examples of these ships being grabbed on the high seas. And I think the Russians are getting alarmed about this. And Sergei Lavrov said, we will retaliate with mirror image measures, which means seizing European shipping. And I can't think of anything that would be more dangerous and inflammatory than that.
You were earlier saying that there is this view that Russia needs to essentially increase its deterrent posture, especially when it comes to Europe. I'm curious about what you think about when it comes to Putin and Trump at this point. Trump is understandably very busy with the war in Iran. But before that, we did see him getting increasingly frustrated with Putin over the fact that, there was no progress on a peace deal with Ukraine. So tell us more about that relationship and what's been happening with it over the last few months, considering the lack of a peace deal, and also how you see this Russia-Ukraine war really developing. How long do you think it's going to go on for, considering that both Putin and Zelensky have their own red lines?
To take the Russian point of view on this, they say that when Putin went to Alaska a year ago and met with Trump, the Anchorage summit, that they came to an understanding about the shape of a peace deal. And we pretty much know what the Russian terms were, although there's no document I can point to and say that it's here, 1, 2, 3. But first of all, the Russians require Ukraine to be neutral, or Finlandized, or whatever you want to call it. This is the root cause. The NATO expansion was the single biggest driver of this conflict from many years before it blew up into a full-scale war. And they require that. They require some degree of demilitarization in Ukraine. And since they've been fighting for 4 years, they require territorial compensation. This is new because back in March 22, when the Ukrainians and Russians sat down and hammered out a draft peace deal, Russia didn't have any territorial demands at all, except for Crimea. They even would have allowed the Donbass to be reintegrated into Ukraine. But after 4 years, I guess Putin has to show the Russian people what we won. And his minimum, at least according to what Russian experts tell me about the Anchorage summit, his minimum was the entire Donbass. That is, those two provinces, Luhansk and Donetsk, of which Ukraine still occupies about 20%. So Putin told Trump that if Ukraine will voluntarily withdraw from the entire Donbass, from that 20% or so that it's still held, we will agree to a general ceasefire and start discussing terms for ending the war. So the Russians felt that it was for Trump to go and tell Zelensky, you got to do this. Trump didn't succeed in doing that. And since then, the conversation got changed. Europeans started inserting their own peace terms, and their attitude is, and Zelensky's attitude is, that Trump should go and tell Putin to accept these and those terms. This gets the Russians' backs up. They have lost any faith, at least for the time being, in Trump's ability to do anything, because they see him as flip-flopping, changing his mind, doing what the last person he talked to told him to do. So I think the Russians, and again, I'm speculating because nobody will say this exactly, but I think they have decided that this is going to get settled on the battlefield. They are advancing on the battlefield. For a wider view of the war, slowly, incrementally, painfully, but at every point of that 1,000-kilometer front, the Russians are advancing. They're also now winning the air war. Which is this latest escalation. Ukraine has greatly improved its capabilities to strike deep into Russia. I know I live in a village not far from Moscow, just to the south, and we hear the air battles going over our heads all the time. That's new. The number of Ukrainian drones that are getting close to Moscow and as far as Moscow has really increased, and they're striking in targets that are like hundreds and even thousands kilometers away from the border. This is new, but Russia has retaliated by striking Kiev and Odessa, which is the main Black Sea port complex that Ukraine has, to a much greater degree. The damage being done to Russia is considerable, and it's painful, and it's brought the war home to Russians in a way that wasn't true before. But on balance, at least according to the last couple of weeks, it's clear that the Russians are hitting Ukraine where it hurts much, much harder. So all that talk that was going on a month or so ago about how Ukraine is turning the tide and possibly winning the war, that has evaporated. And now we're back to the Russians are grinding forward, and the war is going on attritionally still, but it's pretty clear that the Russians aren't losing, and there's no chance of Ukraine winning. And all the political surroundings, this geopolitical noise makes Russia seemingly more determined to win on the battlefield, even if that means escalating some more. And just to conclude this, I think it's possible that next month or month after, the Kremlin will decide on another military mobilization. They haven't forcibly conscripted anybody since 2022, when they mobilized 300,000 men. But they don't have enough people. According to all the laws of war, the mathematics, if you're invading a country, you need like 3 times more troops than they have. And Russia has about 700,000 troops on the front, a 1,000-kilometer-long front. It's not enough to stage major breakthroughs, to take and hold large swaths of territory. So they need more troops, and the only way to get them is a mobilization, a forced mobilization, which is theoretically possible, but it will cause a lot of social discontent.
Exactly. It will have its ramifications, especially considering that, the Russian administration, the Russian people, also those beyond Russia's borders, have largely been criticizing the fact that this is a pattern that we see when it comes to the Ukraine conflict, the Ukraine war. Whereas Zelensky, what's been seen, videos have gone viral online about how normal Ukrainian citizens are getting kidnapped and being forced to enter the Ukrainian forces, despite the fact that they don't have a desire to do so. So you're now saying that it's possible that Russia might do the same. I'm curious about how you think that will then impact how Russians view this war at this point. And we'd even spoken last week to the former advisor to President Putin, Dr. Sergei Markov. Now, he was under the impression that the war with Ukraine will continue. It is going to be a prolonged war. But beyond this, when we take a look at what you've also just said, the people of Russia, do you think they will just stand by and remain okay with what's currently going on? I mean, don't you think that the discontentment, as you just mentioned as well, will only just continue to grow, especially if the Putin administration kidnaps its own people to join the war?
Well, that's a difficult question. I don't see any signs of it. The last time they did have a forced mobilization. As I said, it was late 2022, and they inducted 300,000 people on an emergency basis. It was just after they suffered those terrible battlefield setbacks. And it caused quite a lot of pandemonium, like hundreds of thousands of young men just left the country. There was a lot of upset and turmoil, but they did succeed in getting those 300,000. And since then, they have digitized the reserve list, so it wouldn't be as arbitrary and chaotic a mobilization, I think, as the last one was. And it needs to be pointed out that Russia has about 20 million men on the reserve list. That is, people who've already done their military service, their mandatory military service, and they remain for the rest of their adult lives on this reserve list and eligible for call-up. So it's not exactly the same thing as kidnapping, but yes, it would. I can tell you that most Russians are not at all enthusiastic about the war, and young men, all other things being equal, wouldn't care to go and die because the cause just doesn't resonate with most Russians. Although they're patriotic and they don't want to see their country lose, and when they're asked in poll surveys whether they would like to see peace talks and an end to the war, over 2/3 of them say yes. But if you ask follow-up questions like, would you make concessions to Ukraine? Would you give up territory? They say no, or a large percentage of them say no. So that seems to me to be the state of things. I'm guessing that if they have a limited mobilization, say 500,000 people or whatever, I think that's probably what they need. They will succeed, but it will cause political strains. People will be disaffected, but nobody ever made money betting on the Russian people's likelihood of collapsing under economic or social strain. They're very, very tough people, and they do seem to have accepted Putin's argument that we're not just fighting against Ukraine, we're fighting against the collective West. They're all piling on against us, And if we lose, they will militarize Ukraine, get it into NATO, and see at that point, almost all Russians start to agree with Putin that the war is necessary.
But then do you think that Russia is ready for an expanded war? Let's say, hypothetically, NATO does get involved. Can Russia sustain a war like that?
I think we're in year 5 of a war that people were always saying they couldn't sustain. And they're producing more missiles and more ammunition than ever. And so I got to say, yes, I think they can. I think they're better prepared than the West for a serious war. God forbid that it should happen. But yeah, I think that Russia has surprised everybody with its resilience. And the war has greatly boosted its industrial capacity. And I see from the latest figures that the Russian economy is growing again, small, half a percentage point or something, but it was in recession early this year. So I wouldn't bet on Russian collapse or Putin being overthrown or any of that.
So speaking once again hypothetically, there have been indications that China, for example, could invade Taiwan, especially in the New Year's message that Xi Jinping had given, calling Taiwan, again, their territory. What is your take on America's capacity to help in a situation like that, given their depleted weapons stockpile?
Yeah, that must be what they're asking in the Pentagon, because if what we're reading in the media about how seriously their stockpiles have been depleted is true, then they're in deep trouble if they have to face another big war. They're already in one that they can't seem to handle. And a war with China over Taiwan in the South China Sea, and that would be a really, really big war, for which they aren't prepared in terms of ammunition, but also the way that tactics have changed and military technology has changed during this Ukraine war is quite radical. And as we said earlier,
especially with drone warfare,
the Americans have not kept up with this. They have a lot of inertia, and if they had to go into a big war, I think the Chinese are ahead of this, and the Chinese have been very closely observing the Russia-Ukraine war from the Russian side. They've probably taken on board the lessons, and they have a huge drone industry. They're making a lot of strides. I'm not advocating any of this, you understand. I find it horrifying to think of such a war breaking out. But yes, I don't think America would be prepared for it, and it would really. Well, you see right now the way the Americans are floundering in the Persian Gulf. I mean, it's clear that they've got caught in a wringer and can't extricate themselves from it, and that's a little problem compared to what a war in the South China Sea would be like.
I'm curious, America's stockpiles have been informed by previous wars and invasions, such as Afghanistan and Iraq. Mass stockpiles of munitions were not required at this point. Do you think that U.S. military planners assumed that every conflict would not require massive use of munitions and hence did not upgrade weapons manufacturing? Do you think that's the cause behind all of this?
Yeah, fighting the last war, yes, apparently that's a thing. But also, I think that the Pentagon budget is something that gets fought over and divided up, and there never was enough to put American industry And that if you want to keep your military well armed and equipped and ready to fight two big wars at once, which I think that's what doctrine says, you would probably need much more than even the gargantuan sums that they've been spending. You see, the Trump administration are now putting forward a $1.5 trillion Pentagon budget. So they're playing catch up. But if you're talking about a war breaking out soon over Taiwan, that's not going to be anywhere near soon enough.
One final question, because this did come up in, as I mentioned, one of the previous interviews that we had when we spoke to the former advisor to Russian President Putin. He had mentioned that Putin is, of course, a great person to work with. He mentioned that he has a great sense of humor. Considering that you are reporting in Moscow, could you let us know if there are any tidbits that you've learned about what it's like to work with Putin?
Well, I've only ever met him a couple of times. It's not that easy to get near to him. And as journalists, even when you do, you're held back. You've got your notebook, you take notes, but you don't interact with him. Sergei Markov, whom I know very well, has had the pleasure of dining with Putin, breaking bread, and presumably joking around. So I would take it from him. I don't know. But in general, my view of Putin is that he's a very competent person. He's well briefed. He's a lot of the things you read about how he's living in a bubble and he's not well informed and he's delusional, and that's all got to be nonsense. No, he demonstrates every time he opens his mouth at one of these meetings, and he talks a lot, that he really is on top of what's going on.
All right. Mr. Weir, thank you so much for joining us, providing us with a lot more insight and giving us crucial viewpoints on what's taking place globally, especially when we talk about the Russia-Ukraine war and the impact that the America-Iran war has had on it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.